Hey, this is DJTM. I'm going to give you a bit of a walkthrough on some of the slightly more advanced features of tempo management when you look between track decks and remix decks and actually getting all that to work a little bit better for you. It's probably one of the features in Traktor that users struggle to understand is that up in this global panel, normally it's FX1, but if you click on the metronome, you actually get access to the what's called the global master clock, or the master tempo. Now, what often confuses people is that this is the primary source of tempo, except if you enable the auto button, which most users starting out do, then any track that's playing will become the tempo master, the master source. So this master icon will get illuminated in each of the decks. So if I go ahead and load a track into deck A, and start it playing, you'll notice that immediately the master icon turns on and deck A is now the master tempo. So if I of course go and load a track into deck B, this track has only a slightly different BPM, not a great example, but if I was to then press sync, of course that will sync to the tempo master, which is deck A, and will play at 128 beats per minute. And if I was to drop that in at one of its cue points, hold that down just for the minute, because I'm using just my keyboard and mouse here, those two are beautifully lined up. As soon as I stop playing deck A, you'll notice that the master icon turns off and goes back up to the master clock, because that is that the master source must be a playing deck, and if there is no deck playing, it will jump back to this clock master as the tempo source. And there's nothing playing, so it's more an internal feature of Traktor. Where the global clock is really useful is making sure your remix and track decks are absolutely all using the same tempo source, because of course if they're not, then all hell can break loose with your remix sets. So now if we look at the way that matching tempos and syncing gets a little more complicated in the remix decks, now that hopefully you understand the basic track deck version first, what I'll do is you'll see that my remix decks are expanded into advanced mode, and to do this you need to double click on the grey bar, the grey area above the new remix set title. So if I was to click that, actually I've gone from the most expanded advanced view. This just cycles through views on each remix deck. So click again, double click again, I get an interim, double click, I get a few more controls, double click, I now get some looping and extra controls, and double click again and I get right up to the most expanded advanced view of the remix deck, where you can see the pitch and the gain and whether it's punch and sync and looping controls. Now nothing loaded, so that's why these are grayed out. One other thing I've got here is, because I was playing around before the tutorial, I've got my remix source, the capture source, set to deck B. So of course a remix deck can actually capture from any other track deck or the loop recorder. So track deck A, track deck B, or the loop recorder. So here I'm going to capture my first sample from remix deck A. And you can change this on the fly. That's the great flexibility of the remix decks. So I'll just return my first track deck A just to the starting cue there, and let's just have a quick review of where the tempos are at. Now at the moment all the tempos, and particularly the remix decks, have defaulted to 120 beats per minute. Somewhat that's irrelevant for the moment, but we will get there. But what's important at the moment really is that the track deck is 120 beats per minute. Now I'm going to set a very simple 4-beat loop on the start of this deck, and just to help you visualize it, and I'm going to sample that into the first slot in my remix set. So you can see the Come With Me title, and here it is down here as well, so that's been captured. So now I've got my 4-beat loop at 120 beats per minute, and if I go and play that loop in deck A, now what we need to do is make sure that sync is turned on the remix deck, or when I play this sample, it's not actually going to play in time, so I can show you that. Okay, so I messed up there. That is actually in time because captured from the main source. But if I actually then hit sync again, those two will be perfectly lined up. So it was hard to hear, but those two were just ever so slightly out of perfect sync because of the way I triggered it. But with sync on, they line up in sync. Now, you'll also notice that a remix slot, so each individual sample slot, has the ability to sync to the remix deck's source or from its original capture source. And this becomes more obvious. Let me just stop playing so I can slow this down for everyone a little bit. And I'll assign that loop into Q.2 just so I got access to it again. So I'm going to load a track of slightly different tempo. I just happen to have one here. Let's go and load a current classic you'll love. Ignore my taste in music, which has automatically synced. So let's just zero out this crossfader so that sync is enabled. So it was reverting to 120. So quick check on where we are. Currently nothing playing, so the master clock is the master. A little bit irrelevant in this example. Deck A has a tempo, its default tempo, it hasn't been changed, of 120 beats per minute. Same with the remix deck, which has an initial sample of 120 beats per minute. Now I'm actually going to change the capture source to deck B. So here I am sort of messing with a normal workflow of just capturing from one track deck into a remix deck. And again, if I set, say, a 4-beat sample, pretty basic loop there, and I'm going to capture that into the second slot of remix deck C. You can now see I've got the Your Love title. Now what's important to note here is because I've captured everything at its default tempo, I've actually now got a sample that is 120 beats per minute and a sample that's 125 beats per minute. But with the beauty of synchronization, everything will sound seamless because actually in this case the Your Love sample will be slowed down to 120 because the sync on that slot will be lining it up with the remix deck's tempo. So that's a bit hard to see without me actually doing it for you. So let's get deck A going as the example of you've got some bass line you want to play or some beat. So that's happily moving away. Deck A is now the tempo master just because I happen to have had the clock source in auto mode. And I could make that the master as well, but let's leave the master tempo on deck A. Now, remix deck C, sync is on. Turn it off and make sure it's turned on. And now when I play this remix set, or the remix deck, it will be in time, it will be synced up to the current tempo master, which is deck A. See, instantly that's played, and that's all beautifully in sync. And now if I trigger the new sample from the deck B, which was actually faster, you'll notice that that's moving perfectly in time at the 120 beats per minute that we captured. Now where I can cause a train wreck here is if I turn off sync, everything should stay exactly as it does. And you'll notice, no real change. I'm going to press it again. That's because at the moment all the tempos of the samples are 120 beats per minute and beautifully synchronized with deck A. But if I turn off the sample slot sync, particularly on this Your Love, it's actually going to go up to its original tempo of 125 and cause a delightful train smash. Hard to hear because it's a small difference, but this sample is now running faster. You can see slightly because that playhead is moving just slightly out of time with where the first playhead is, and it's finishing and slowly moving away. But if I press sync, because this Your Love sample is selected, those two are beautifully lined up again and everything's running at 120 beats per minute. So what you need to understand is that the sync button in the advanced panel is for the actual slot. If it is turned on, the sample will be synchronized to the remix deck tempo. In the case of this first sample that was originally at 120 beats per minute, there would be no change. See whether I turn that on or off? No noticeable change because the tempos are the same. Where this becomes even more important is, for whatever reason, if I actually stop everything and now I'm going to pitch everything up to a completely new tempo. I need to quickly find there's a good one. Drag that up into my deck. Now I've got a track at a much faster tempo. It's a very beaty track. Might sound a little bit weird because I haven't tried to play this, but if I now play these synchronized, see they've already synced to the 133.98 tempo of deck B. I'm going to have to activate a loop here just to make it easier to work with. So they are actually all nicely in time. Everything has been brought up to 138 beats per minute. But if I go and disable sync on any of these individual slots, now you'll see that there's no change in that first slot because it was originally the same tempo as the track deck itself. But now those do seem to be slightly moving away from each other. But there'll be a more noticeable difference if I disable sync on that original sample, which was 5 beats per minute different. And you can see I've instantly created a train smash there. Re-enable sync, and everything lines up again. And you notice now that I've stopped playing the track deck, now that the only thing playing is the remix set, that's now the master tempo as well. Turn that off and it goes back to the global tempo. So hopefully that gives you a better feel for how the clock, sources and tempo work in the remix deck scenario, where you've got samples from multiple sources at different tempos. For most users, the most important thing is going to be that you use sync and actually line that up to whatever the tempo source is. One of your track decks is the most likely source, as you're playing out a beat or a track and then you want to do a remix over the top of it. But also being aware of how the individual sync of the slots works is important, especially if you capture from tempos that are different to one another in each individual slot. All right, guys, hit me up on the Native Instruments forum or at djtmhire.com.